Yes, there are Tongans in the room. Thank you very much for inviting me, Sarah, and everyone else. It's lovely to see faces I know, and knowing that other faces of the room, whom I can't see on the screen, are there. Can you hear me? Is the sound okay?
Yeah.
So, let's talk about rugby. It's a sport I chose completely at random. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Is there an echo?
Now, I mean, it's okay when you're speaking slower. If you can just go slowly like this, then you'll be fine.
Okay, fine. So, as everyone has grown up participating in Fiji, Samoa knows, or spent significant time there, rugby as a sport has...
I think you just need to speak to the mic. That's the thing. That's why when you're speaking to us directly, we hear you really clearly. But when you're reading from the slides or the paper, then it's hard to. I think that's.
Okay.
Maybe stand back a bit from the mic.
Or yeah, or you can maybe move back a little.
Move back.
Yeah. and just keep your face towards the screen. I guess. Sorry.
No problem. So is this better?
Yes.
Is it? Okay, good. So when I personally first came to Tonga in 1977, the secondary school where I was teaching at college was very serious about rugby. Virtually all boys played it, or were involved in the game in one fashion or the other. Rugby was fun, but it was serious fun, and occasionally it gave rise to brawls, egos, and black eye, and sometimes worse. Let me just... Okay. Could it be that my voice is picked again by your microphone?
I'll turn up the microphone and see.
Yeah, I think that might...
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Next slide, Sarah, please. Should be the slide of La Paha Tonga, boys playing rugby.
Yeah.
But boys also played informal games of touch rugby every evening in whatever field was available, as the MH did and still do on a daily basis in every village green of Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. These informal games were, and still are, a prime site of gender socialization. Younger boys learned not just how to play rugby, but also how to interact with one another, how to confound adversaries, a prized skill amongst young men, how to respect hierarchies. In other words, how to be a man. So fast forward to the present. Rugby is still serious fun in the region, but it is no longer just that. Because in the 1980s, Pacific peoples began realizing that their extraordinary passion and skill for the sport could be transformed into employment, social mobility, and geographical mobility. A geographical mobility that in the meantime had become highly desirable for quite complex reasons, not just economic. Next slide, please. I suspect, but I may be wrong, that the pioneers were my Tongan friends in Japan. Sinari latu watesane namoa, nofomulita mofolau, hopoi tayone, who began migrating to play rugby in Japan from 1985, and many are still living in Japan. They're now long retired, but they started a flow of rugby migrants that continue to this day. And today, of course, these patterns involve much more than Tonga and Japan, than migration between Tonga and Japan. We find professional and aspiring professional rugby players in both union and league from Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, as well as Wallis and Futuna, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, Tahiti, PNG, and other places in New Zealand, Australia, France, the UK, the US, and a myriad other sometimes surprising places, like Romania, Sri Lanka, and the Netherlands. Rugby migrations have had a tremendous effect on Pacific Island societies. Today, for better or for worse, the possibility of migrating for rugby is a major focus in how young men and their families in the three countries, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, view the future, even though, for most, the probability of landing a rugby contract is very small. Next slide, please. Despite the significant discrepancy between probability and possibility, young men in towns and villages doggedly train every day, often under adverse conditions, hoping that their skill and their faith in God together will give them a breakthrough. Next slide. These dynamics have emerged in a much broader context that we need to take into account in order to understand them. And this is what my global sport research team has been working on in several sports and in many parts of the world in the last 5 years, thanks to this very generous funding from the European Research Council that Sarah mentioned. The first aspect of the global context is the fact that the reinvention rugby from fun to labor in the Pacific has emerged at the same time as major transformations in the world of rugby in particular and in sport in general. Transformations that have played a pivotal role in what happens in remote villages and islands of the region. Starting in the 1980s, the world of sport was transformed from a largely amateur and local world into a mega business. The cause, arguably, was television, and more specifically, the privatization of television channels in the industrial world. Because when I was a child growing up in Europe, state authorities of the various countries held strict monopolies on television broadcasting, which was limited to a couple of channels per country. In the 1980s, all this changed radically. State governments began selling broadcasting rights to private interests, and privately owned channels proliferated, but they also needed to fill time with cheap content. That's the way capitalism works. The answer was sport. Sport is unscripted, requires minimal infrastructure, and is therefore theoretically easy to broadcast and fill airtime with. Then, satellite television technology was developed at about the same time, in fact. Television now could reach the remotest corners of the world, the small villages of the islands of Fiji and elsewhere, bringing spectacular images of sporting glory and of the performance of masculinity to audiences around the world. In Africa, for example, people then lost interest in their own soccer, preferring to watch English Premier League, usually in bars in villages. And in Fijian villages, anthropologist Karen Bryson writes, boys, having witnessed boys playing rugby around Raki, emulating what they see on Australian TV channels, shouting, instant replay, as they play in the village green, or slow motion, right? Emulating, in other words, emulating television. The global television business today generates huge sums of money, enriching sleazebags like Rupert Murdoch with professional sport, largely soccer, rugby, cricket, basketball, American football, and baseball. With these sports playing a very, very prominent role in this accumulation of obscene amounts of money. These global transformations are rooted in an even larger transformation of the world. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an economic and social program that is predicated, to simplify things, on the reduction of the state, the due regulation of markets, and privatization. Privatization, not just of TV, although it is part of this world trend, but also of everything else, including education, healthcare, caring for the poor, and the labor market. Like a steamroller, neoliberalism has fundamentally altered everything we do, everything we are, everything we aspire for. And this includes masculinity, sport, and work. So here I'm making a historical argument that I think is very, very important to make when we're talking about masculinity in relation to sport or masculinity on its own. Next slide, please, Sarah. Today, masculinity has become a commodity in this context. Migrant rugby players, or perhaps their agents and recruiters from the Pacific, sell masculinity to clubs in the global north who are themselves involved in cutthroat competition with one another for the next undiscovered talent who will help generate visibility for the club and thus money. Next slide. Thus emerges the image of the Mbati in the Fijian context, the island warrior of yesteryear, of which contemporary rugby players claim descent. Images that are repeated over and over again in the press overseas and interviews we held with club managers, trainers, and so on. It is a commodity that supports families in the islands, including frequently numerous cousins whom successful rugby players previously did not know existed, sometimes providing wealth that the families could never have hoped for otherwise, at least as long as the bodies of the rugby players themselves can endure the punishing regimes of work to which they are subjected. Next slide. It's a commodity that gives a new visibility to island countries that they could not have claimed otherwise. Rugby masculinity shows the world what Fijians, Tongans, and Samoans are capable of. And Fiji's celebrated Rugby Sevens gold medal at the Rio Olympics, which I was privileged to witness, is a spectacular example. But it is potentially a problematic commodity. First, rugby bodies only last so long, just a few years, at the end of which the sport industries drop many of its professionals onto the scrap heap of poverty, depression, and ill health, frequently suspended between the island homes and the countries where they last played. The work of Yoko Kanematsu is very relevant here. Next slide. On the other hand, the sport world craves the spectacular displays of rugby masculinity. Witness the thunderous response all over the world to the pre-game mbole, sipitao, and sibatao. On the other hand, the first one was on the one hand. On the other hand, rugby players, whether Pacific Islanders or others, are laborers in a neoliberal industry, which demands that they conform to a particular way of being a worker. Flexible, individualized, obedient, self-monitoring, in all minute aspects of their lives, responsible for their own successes and failures, even those over which they have no control, prepared to be employed or unemployed at the drop of a hat, willing to erase the boundary between private life and work life. In such context, rugby becomes the worker's life. These qualities are very different from those that were expected of professional athletes prior to the 1980s and prior to the flow of Pacific Islanders in global rugby. For Pacific Islanders in global rugby, as well as athletes from many parts of the global south in a multitude of sports, these dynamics present a catch-22. On the one hand, their meal ticket is the spectacular performance of masculine power and skill, which is what clubs expect of them. On the other hand, they're expected to be flexible, individualized, and self-responsibilized neoliberal workers. Next slide. Few, if any, club managers, coaches, recruiters, and agents have expressed to us an understanding of these dilemmas. Instead, they see the masculine excesses of particular players in the form of drinking, womanizing, violence, crashing cars, not showing up for training, as problems with individuals rather than structural problems. So they don't see the contradiction between the violence that is expected of them on this masculine violence that is expected of them to perform on the rugby field and the presentation of self and the very notion of self that is expected of them in a neoliberal workplace, in which, in particular, surveillance is extreme, one of the most extreme, alongside with the military that Kathy was talking about. The warrior after all, it is unruly, undisciplined, and unmanageable, according to these managers. And here, I'm bringing up something that Matthew introduced, namely this notion of hegemonic masculinity, of which I'm quite critical. I don't have the time to really expand on this, but I think that sort of abiding by this notion that one masculinity is hegemonic over both women and other men tends to be problematic, because I think they're very, very contradictory forms of masculinity that are at play and that clash at the same time, each of which is hegemonic at the same time, which sort of puts into question the notion of hegemony. Two things cannot be hegemonic at the same time in the same context. Next slide, Sarah. This is where we need to understand the new prominence of religiosity in general, and in particular of Pentecostalism and charismatic Christianity in particular in Pacific Island Rugby. And this is a theme that has emerged in our project in extremely interesting ways and in different parts of the world. And here I'll add a very, very quick comparative dimension, which I won't have the time to elaborate. So Pentecostalism, which is, as you know, living in Fiji, is is growing extremely rapidly, offers a religious version of the neoliberal self. The believer places his or her faith in God in a deeply uncertain world, in the same way that the neoliberal worker must have faith in a system that is suffused with unpredictability, inequality, and unfairness. Pentecostal masculinity is God-fearing, driven by faith, responsible for its own actions, celibate or monogamous, hardly feminist, as Matthew mentioned, resembles closely one version of masculinity that rugby clubs expect of their workers. Next slide. These patterns are found in almost exactly the same form. We're looking at Cameroon now, and on the slide. Yeah, Sarah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. In the same form in many other parts of the world, for example, in West and Central Africa, in reference to soccer, which is where some of my co-workers on the project have worked. So, to finish, I'm almost at the 20 minutes. Next slide. To understand modern-day Pacific masculinities in sport, one must open one's net as wide as possible, and I invite you to consult some of the blog pieces in particular on the website of our project. We must consider the global effects of neoliberalism, the privatization of television, which at first glance has really nothing to do, but in fact, when you start thinking about it, has everything to do with what is going on in Fijian villages, in Tongan villages. The advent of satellite television, which broadcasts this glorified images of masculinity on the global scene to young boys in villages. The corporatization of sport, the transformation of work, the global spread of particular forms of Christianity, and as well as many other things I did not have the time to talk about or to emphasize, including militarism. I had promised Kathy that we'd talk about militarism, but I figured that I realized that I didn't have the time. The private security industries, which in the work of Yoko and the regretted Teresia Teaewa, whom we all mourn, extremely interesting how Pacific Islanders are getting into these industries, and as in parallel to the sport industries in ways that perhaps we'll have the time to talk about. We need to look at geographical and social mobility, changing definitions of labor, the emergence, for example, of the category of, quote-unquote, the unemployed youth, which 30 years ago did not exist in the Pacific. We need to look at economic precarity, social inequalities in local contexts, and global inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Niko. Is there any question or comment for Niko? Well, I'll ask one since we won't have you here
think the two of the things that one is do you want to turn on the microphone so they don't and then turn it on again when I'm finished. So a couple of things. One is a comparative dimension, that what is happening with masculinity in the Pacific is in fact not that different from what is happening with masculinity in, let's say, West Africa. And I think we need to really put out our antennas out for work that is going on in other parts of the world and have this comparative perspective front and center to what we're trying to do. And I mean, this is something that I myself have become aware of directing this large comparative project, the importance of comparison across different parts of the world, across contexts that seem to be very, very different. The other thing that I think is extremely important is to pay attention to history. History, including the recent history of the last 30, 40 years, because the world in the 1970s is not the world that it is today. And gender in general and masculinity in particular have undergone fundamental transformations in during that period. And I think we need to really very much pay attention to the changing conditions that reshape gender. So Kathy, for example, was talking about militarism, and this is one one place where we need to we're very much aware. The world of the military today is extremely different from what it used to be, and I think that the people who are involved in these industries also have had to change and adapt to very different kinds of conditions. And lastly, I would say that also what is extremely important when we look at sport is changing patterns of mobility and migration. Since other than Fiji, Pacific Island countries cannot support a serious professional sport industry, and Fiji does it by the skin of its teeth. So sporting success lies elsewhere. And as we know, Pacific Island societies have become diasporic, Tonga, Samoa first in the 1970s and 1970s, and then Fiji has followed first with Indo-Fijians who have been migrating for longer than indigenous Itāukei. But I think we need to embed our understanding of what sport means for young men in particular, and of course young women, the work of Yoko, in the context of these migrations. I'm done.